So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it's the protection of a fundamental human right.
Hello, and welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast, the podcast where we talk justice over coffee with a special guest. And on this episode, I spoke with academic and activist Giorgia Dona. Giorgia has held positions at Oxford University's Refugee Studies programme, the Child Studies Unit of University College Cork Island, and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has undergone consultancy work for UNICEF, the International Office of Migration, governments and NGOs, and is currently the Professor of Forced Migration and Refugee Studies at the University of East London. Giorgia has very kindly agreed to come on the podcast at short notice to talk about this latest wave of anti-immigrant protests and demonstrations that we've been seeing across the UK. So let's see if we can glean a little more nuance on this development from someone as educated on this subject matter as Giorgia. But before we dive in, this podcast is sponsored by Oakwood Risk Group. We specialise in business continuity, resilience and risk management. So if you're in need of safeguarding your company or client's future, why not get in touch through our website, oakwoodriskgroup.com. We have a new online course launching today, Friday the 8th of August, which will qualify you as a certified crisis management professional. So check it out, and listeners to the podcast will get a 10% discount if they use the code BlueBearJustice when booking onto the course. For more information, visit oakwoodriskgroup.com. Now, let's speak to Professor Giorgia Dona. Giorgia, welcome to the Justice and Coffee podcast. It's great to have a chance to sit down virtually with you, have a coffee and talk all things forced migration and refugee studies. And I'm really excited just to squeeze some of your knowledge out in the next 30, 40 minutes. So yeah, welcome to the podcast. I'm really blessed to have you with us.
Yeah, and thank you for having me, and hi to you and your audience as well.
So why don't we start with coffee in order not to break any of our usual routes and routines? Now, I can hear there's a bit of an Italian accent there. I think your name's a somewhat giveaway. Would it be fair to imagine that as an Italian citizen living in the UK, you remain passionate about your coffee?
I mean, coffee is part of my culture, my upbringing, like, espresso. And then also over the years, I lived overseas and I lived in coffee producing countries. So my taste has become more sophisticated. So I was like spending time in Guatemala, I spent time in Rwanda. So I learned about coffee, and I'm known to my colleagues to always have a cup of coffee beside me when I have meetings, and I have one right now, right here. Perfect. That's my usual way. Yeah. So coffee is a great part of my life. Yes. Both my life over time and my life now. Yes. I love coffee.
I got into a rather animated conversation with a lady just yesterday in my coffee shop, an Italian lady over espresso, as to what was and what wasn't the perfect balance of coffee to water in our espresso, whether it's ristretto, whether it's lungo, whether it's a perfectly balanced espresso in the middle. It got pretty heated, but I'm glad to hear you reference Guatemala and Rwanda, two of my favorite coffee growing countries. We've had coffee through Blue Bear from both of those countries. And yeah, hey, what a privilege to be able to drink Guatemalan coffee and Rwandan coffee in nation rather than have it exported across the world. That must have been pretty cool.
I know, it's really special. I agree. Yeah.
So what I would love for you to do for me and for the listener, because you are so learned and you've got such a remarkable career that I've been investigating these last few days in preparation for our call, I kind of want you to give a whistle-stop tour, basically, as to what you deem to be relevant for today's conversation, as to how you've arrived at, as a professor at the University of East London, on forced migration and refugee studies via all sorts of ports and calls. So if you could do that for us, that would really help me.
Yeah, I'll try to summarize a life in a few minutes. But I mean, I suppose my interest in social justice stems back to when I was a teenager, really, because I remember kind of going around and collecting old clothes, used clothes, and then they were, sold, and the profits were going to social projects in Latin America. And then I was also a member of Amnesty International as a teenager. And then throughout my career, really, I spent my career both as a researcher, but also as a practitioner and an activist working with and for refugees across the world. So I spent time, as I said, with Guatemalan refugees in Mexico, looking at their well-being and cultural changes. I worked in Rwanda as a practitioner, looking at how in post-genocide Rwanda, unaccompanied and separated children could be hosted in foster families, in centers and with families. And then, in the last few years, I have spent some time in Calais, working with, people who were trying to come across. And then in the UK with unaccompanied and separated children, looking at social care. And also I'm now interested in the arts. So I've been collaborating with refugees. And we had an exhibition last year called Talash that looked at the UK through the lens of refugees. So it was called Reversing the Gaze. Yeah. So it's different, coming from different points of view. I also, of course, at the university, I co-direct the Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging, and I teach in Masters in Refugee Studies, Conflict, Displacement and Human Security. So that's really my life.
Well done, Giorgia, for summing that up so succinctly. That's a real challenge. It's interesting you mentioned Calais. So part of my journey into humanitarian work started in Calais too. I was working in private equity as a security and risk advisor, was largely disillusioned with where I was, what I was doing, and thought this is probably not the best, most productive use of my time. And at the time, do you remember the camp that was referred to as the jungle?
Of course, yes.
So that was the French authorities had finally got permission to start dismantling it and tearing it down. So that was dominating the news cycle at the time. And I ended up going there just without a great deal of preparation, filling my car with some of the goods that were being requested by one of the charities there, Care for Calais, and driving over there. And I ended up doing a couple of trips, tokenistic, very, no, I wasn't an in-depth supporter. It was just a response. But what it did in terms of allowing me to see that I don't have to be suspended behind a TV screen, watching the news, but actually with not so much effort, you could be part of it as well. You could go and see for yourself. You could hopefully find great causes that you can then put your shoulder behind. And that was really helpful. I went on after that to work for a number of organizations, but it started in Calais. And it's interesting that, gosh, that would have been 2016, 17.
That's right. We probably our paths crossed.
Oh, wow. Yeah, imagine that. And here we are almost 10 years later, and that subject of small boats and the challenge of immigration and UK's hostility towards people coming, whether they're seeking asylum or claiming refugee status, it doesn't seem to have diminished. If not, it's got even more dramatic. I would love you to speak on that, actually, and help us understand whether this is a new thing or whether this is a seasonal occurrence of which we've seen waves in our history in the UK of how we treat the outsider.
Yes, I mean, I would say that looking historically, this is not necessarily what we're seeing now. Even the protest, the violence outside asylum hotels is just a flashpoint. It's a symptom of something that is recurrent. We had, similar protests over time. And there's always kind of this tendency to in a way to scapegoat sometimes the other for issues and problems that are economic, social, and it's in a way it's not fair in terms of justice. It's not fair, but it is understandable. I mean, I am very concerned about what is going on, like even last weekend in Epping, because it's a worrying sign of something that is broader, and it's whether it's the far right appropriating the narrative, whether it's again the politicians not necessarily kind of developing policies like asylum hotels that are conducive to integration. And in fact, I'm just doing a small piece at the moment with colleagues at SOAS, where we're trying to look at the ways in which there are alternatives to integrate to asylum hotels that are better both for taxpayers, for asylum seekers, and for local communities. And all the research we do over time shows that it's much better if, asylum seekers who come and are in the system, they can be accommodated in smaller units, interspersed with communities. But also, we're suggesting that we could even go further, and I'm sure that your audience might be sympathetic to that, thinking about homestays that we could host, refugees, the home for Ukrainians. Why not do it for all? And I personally have hosted refugees over time in my space. And it's been a really rewarding experience. You get to know other people, you get to help somebody, and you develop friendships that, last forever. So I have, if I can just give an example, I hosted an Eritrean refugee years ago who traveled through Calais and is now has refugee status, is married with 3 children. And every year they come and, spend a week with me. It's like they become a family. So it's really a good experience. And why not use that as an alternative to asylum hotels?
I'm interested actually in what you've said about possible alternative solutions, and including having an open house system like what we saw happen with Ukrainian refugees, maybe to a certain extent Hong Kongers. Besides that being a solution, what other alternate options have you discovered in your studies beyond sort of relying on society to personally open their doors?
Well, so in the past, within the asylum system and even the dispersal with all its challenges, had accommodation for asylum seekers. So I should point out that asylum seekers are people who have arrived in this country and have asked for protection, and they are, under the, they are in the system, and the UK government has signed international conventions saying that it would provide for their, for their accommodation and some support. It's below poverty level, but some support while they are in the system, while the government is processing their application. So accommodation is one of them. And in the past, they were placed in apartments. They were placed in, in private accommodation. There were a lot of collaboration with local authorities that can have really a big role because they know the community. And also that means that asylum seekers have access to services. The idea of placing them like, in barracks, like I went to Napier Barracks, in Folkestone. It's like placing them in like almost carceral situation for people who might have been in prison. So it's not really the ideal situation. It may appear to be convenient. We know that hotels were just an emergency situation during COVID, but really they're not the best way for anybody to place people who are in the asylum system.
No, I would agree with that entirely. And I don't know what the solution is. I love the idea of us being more adoptive. I think that would be a real challenge to communicate that. And I think it would be fair to say, as controversial as it might sound, there is, I believe, a degree of racial bias there. I think that is evident in how we responded to Ukrainian refugees. Okay, it was very obvious that they were victims of an unjust war within the European borders, and our awareness of the Second World War and everything that left behind hasn't totally disappeared, thank the Lord. It is obviously fading as we lose generations, and I think that's the danger. We forget what it was like to actually be at war and how ruthlessly we have to go after peace because of that learning. But I think the way we deal with Eritrean refugees or Sudanese refugees or even Afghan refugees that we may have served alongside when we went to war in their nation, that does seem to be different to the way we've treated, rightly or wrongly, Ukrainian refugees. Well, I would say wrongly, but that does seem to be a difference. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's definitely fair, and I have in a way spoken about it. And the way in which I've kind of thought about it is that there is, one could say, there are hierarchies of refugees, and these hierarchies have a racial and gender undertone.
Right.
So I understand that it's, women and children are the ones who are given, preference because they appear to be, needy. So there is this idea that a refugee is either a victim or a threat. Mm-hmm. And then, young men, especially if they're brown or black men, they're perceived to be a threat. But again, my experience of hosting refugees from Eritrea, from Iran, from Nigeria, is that women, men, young, old, they're just human beings, really. And again, the moment somebody, and most of them are really hardworking people who want to flee conflicts, flee persecution. they're really keen to contribute to the UK. So, the majority are people who really then end up being the doctors, the nurses, the social care workers, the people working in supermarkets. They feel so many gaps in the economy and in the society. I think there is a bit of a perception that is racialized and gendered in relation to the same people who are all seeking protection.
I sometimes reflect on characters such as Wilberforce, an abolitionist who worked extremely hard to turn the tide in slavery and how we dealt with slavery in the UK and then within our colonies, and then the consequence of that was international, how that cascaded out to other nations and the way they treated slavery. And what I find interesting when I sort of studied Wilberforce was you would think that he would make his argument purely on his position as a Christian and pursuing the morality around treating people who should be considered made in the image of God as less than people. But actually, very much of his progress was made as a consequence of making an economic argument and making people aware, actually, this is going to cost you more by keeping slaves. In fact, you run the risk of them revolting. Here's the example in Haiti. Here's the example somewhere else. And that could be detrimental to your trade, whereas if you provide them with employment, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's something for that now. I think relying on people's compassion or humanity as the single point of persuasion is probably not going to be enough. We have to there needs to be more layers to our approach to convincing people that actually just closing our borders is not going to be the answer to all of our problems. What do you think to that?
Yeah, I definitely think that there are, as you said, it's a complex issue and there are different layers to it. I think the economic one is an important one. Then there is also the human rights one. The UK has signed international legislation because it's part of a community of nations, United Nations. And then there are also kind of social and cultural advantages and networks in a globalizing world. So yeah, I mean, economically, we know that, migrants in general contribute to the economy through their taxes. We know that they do want to work, and at the moment they are prevented from working. So if you are in the asylum system, you cannot work at all. You are prevented from. And many asylum seekers I spoke to, they actually don't quite understand. They say, I want to contribute, I want to do something. And then they end up doing volunteering. But yeah, but they could contribute. And then once they get, status, then they really kind of put the effort, the long hours. And again, if we look at all the jobs that the economy that they need to fill the economy, many of them are jobs that migrants take in at different levels. Yeah. So I'm going from, social care to doctors to, garbage collectors, working in shops, teachers. I mean, it's the whole economy that is in a way reliant on the work, the labor of migrants. But also socially and culturally, I think that places like London, cosmopolitan London, is very attractive because people don't just bring their kind of economic contribution, but they also bring their culture, their way of seeing, whether it's the food, whether it's the coffee. If you think of coffee, I have to, it's my Italian migrants who probably have contributed over generations to the spread of the pleasure of having a coffee, which I think is quite nice, in the UK. And in history, in every country, there are ways cultures change, societies change, economies change. Mm. So I think the economic point that you're making is an important one. And then there is the human rights one, where in order to live together as countries, we do have to have certain rules and regulations that enable us to work and sign conventions that if you flee persecution, you have a right to seek asylum, is kind of should be the norm. And it's been eroded in the last, few years in the UK. I agree with you that I think that what we need to do is to make different arguments with different audiences.
Have you seen that done well anywhere, whether it's within our own political system or whether there are neighboring countries that exhibit a better practice in how they have responded to the migration crisis?
So I lived in Canada for a number of years, but again, a few decades ago, I should say, when I was a young and a student. And at that time, Canada had adopted, and like other countries had as well, like Australia, a policy of multiculturalism. So they kind of recognized that there were a history of migrants and that they wanted to, to cherish that history. And therefore, they were welcoming migrants. They were enabling legal routes for migrants and refugees to come into the country. And they were giving them the support that they needed to be there, but also for second and third generations to be able to, maintain their culture. And I think the UK had a bit of that maybe at the end of last century, I suppose, but in the last maybe 15 years, 20 years, we have seen a change in strategy with Theresa May making it very clear that they wanted the UK to become a hostile environment for refugees. And of course, you think it's those who are illegal, those who come by boat. But I want to clarify that people who flee persecution, they sometimes don't have the time to have their passports carry their passports with them. So the Refugee Convention specifies that people should not be penalized for coming to a country and ask for asylum, even without papers. Then they can prove that they have a right to protection. So I just wanted to make that kind of clarification, just to say that, yes, there are countries, and I think the UK in the past had a more welcoming attitude towards migrants and asylum seekers and refugees than it has had in the last 10, 15 years.
And I think one of the reasons there have been noises from the Conservative government previously, not so much now under Labour, but certainly I think if Reform come to power, of leaving the European Court of Human Rights or looking at those commitments and absenting themselves from them for these reasons, which concerns me. But it doesn't make for a particularly interesting interview if you and I just continue to agree with each other because we clearly come from a similar perspective. But I wonder if you were being interviewed by someone who had a different perspective, who would tell you that people seeking refuge or claiming asylum in the UK have often passed through what would be considered to be safe countries, which would have provided them the opportunity to claim asylum within the French borders or German borders or wherever. How would you answer that?
Well, the way in which I would answer that, again, is through probably different entry points. So one entry point is that often people who want to come to the UK, want to come here, they might have family connections or historic connections or language maybe connections. And there is something about, again, the economic value of having people coming that might contribute. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, around this, migration is a global phenomenon. So one is to have kind of agreements. And, the safe country route is an interesting route that some countries, even within Europe, might disagree with. Countries like Italy or countries at the southern border, claiming that if that is the case, then everybody would, in a way, remain in those countries. And that's quite convenient for other countries, but not necessarily for some of them. And it's interesting because at the EU level, for instance, there is a new policy document that has revised that kind of first country rule and has moved towards kind of a sharing of responsibility. And I think that is probably a better approach to the issue of the people come to a first country, then they should stay there. There should be a kind of a different way of looking at how people can be relocated. And it needs to be an international and collaborative effort, really.
Yes, and that is a clear disadvantage of Brexit. That loss of bilateralism, of collaboration, of saying, okay, this is an issue, let's figure out how, as a European Union, we can distribute the burden fairly and support one another as we do that. I know that was certainly, to many people, would say that's one of the advantages of Brexit, is that we no longer need to necessarily carry our part. We can exploit the advantage of being an island nation, but of course I would see that slightly differently. Too many? Do you think the numbers at the moment? I know these aren't, of course, all people seeking asylum, but the overall migration numbers are at their highest level in many years. What do you think about that? How could they be brought down or managed, or the use of safe pathways, etc.? What would you say to that?
So first of all, I say that the numbers are depending on who is counted into those numbers. So if international students are counted as migrants, international students come to the UK, I work in a university, they actually pay foreign fees. So they are a great asset, financial asset to universities. And then they may stay for a few years, but they're likely to move on, move back, move on, move somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they are counted. Hong Kong citizens that in terms of the colonial history of the UK are part, they were colonial subjects, are also counted in those migrants. Migrants who come through work programs like, the social care programs are counted. Asylum seekers and refugees are counted. So when we look at the high numbers, we also need to see who these high numbers are. When it comes to asylum seekers and refugees, 85% of people who flee conflicts remain in the regions of origins.
That's a really helpful statistic. 85% of people, say that again, Giorgia.
So 85% of people who flee conflicts remain in regions of origins. So in the UK, we are kind of looking at high numbers when we think there are 100,000 asylum seekers in the system. But actually in other countries, they're hosting millions. Yeah, it's a totally different, parameter of numbers. If I think of Rwanda, when Rwandans fled after genocide, in Eastern Congo, there were 2 million.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're looking at, a different in proportions. And this is why I think that there is a politicization of migration. So, the move to the far right is really playing on numbers, is really playing on the issue of threat. And it is working, because if you are somebody who lives in the UK and has been here for a long time, even if you're a migrant who might have come through other forms of migration, whether it's economic or even through resettlement, you then kind of absorb these narratives, and then they build up their own reality, which is not necessarily based on reality. And that's why I think that both media or conversations like this are very important in changing the narrative. But also we need to keep challenging the numbers, challenging the political discourses, challenging the media as well, which is complicit sometimes in creating fear when there shouldn't be fear. Because if you create fear or if you create resentment, then it's the first kind of victims might be the asylum seekers. But if I think in Epping, it's also local communities who are paying the price for this narrative. And it's also second and third generation migrants who may be walking across Epping. They may be here, they may have been born here, and then they feel threatened.
Yeah. Besides climate change, which shows no sign of abating, certainly not in the current political climate, that is, of course, a huge motivator of forced migration. When countries become uninhabitable, what more can you do but to pick up your belongings and move? Besides climate change, what are the other big drivers for forced migration?
So, conflicts and wars, we see an expansion of what has been called new wars that last for longer, involve more actors, creating almost economies of war. So wars, persecution, internal arrest is another big cause of migration. And then in a globalized world, there is also like economic migration, people who want to move because they think that they may have a better life somewhere else. Also the elites, I suppose the cosmopolitans that we don't consider migrants, but in a way are migrants. So the 1% who have houses in different countries, they also move, but we don't count them in the, as migrants themselves, but they do move and migrate and have multiple kind of houses.
There seems something of a perfect storm with obviously climate change being a motivator, but also the growth in internet accessibility in developing nations, smartphone access and growth of social media and the means in which people can view lives elsewhere and compare them to your own and think, well, actually, gosh, if that exists somewhere, it's got to be better than this. It's got to be worth taking the risk to travel to in hope of securing a better life for myself, for my family, for my kids. And who can blame someone for having those aspirations? I read somewhere once, and I've been quoting, hopefully accurately, but quite possibly not, that the average time someone spends in a refugee camp is 17 years. I don't know if you're familiar with that statistic.
Yeah, I am quite familiar with that statistic because that's, again, another of these situations where people are caught. They are unable to go back to their home countries because wars last longer. They are unable to move on because the legal routes to resettle to countries in the past are not there. and they can't integrate in the regions because there are so many of them. So they end up stuck in refugee camps in what the UN calls protracted refugee situations for a long time. And that's, again, in limbo for life, for generations as well.
Before we move on and sort of close things out, there was one other area that I wanted to go towards with you. As I did my research around your career, you've written about the issue of genocide. You talked about spending time in Rwanda. And actually, my last question to any guest on this podcast, or my penultimate question to everybody on the podcast is what makes you angry about the world? And I've got a feeling that the issue of genocide might come into it.
Yeah, I think that my main source of anger, sadness, I don't know, so many emotions is the situation in Gaza. Because really, for me, apart from the fact that it's happening in front of our eyes, and you try to do as much as you can, and it's not working, or it's working too late, too slowly. There is, for me, the issue that Gaza is now the litmus test, as they say, of our humanity, because we're letting a genocide happening. And I'm just repeating things that we know, that there is a complicity in our country. So for me, it's more about what can I do as a citizen who is interested in social justice, in trying to change really the situation of the ground. Now it's not even about words, it's about actions.
And what can we do?
Well, I think that we need to come in from many different angles and keep pressures up across the board. That would be my so whether it's protests, petitions, etc. Those are mainly to raise awareness, and then push MPs to change their constituents. So, I do write to my MP regularly, try to raise awareness. And then I think also making sure that there is a narrative that is reflective of the reality. I think many people now use social media and see what is going on the ground. I think mainstream media is still very cautious, at times bias in its narrative of what is going on. So I think that the more we can change the perception and raise awareness, the better it is. But also on a one-to-one level. So when I speak to friends, I realize that friends, family, they come in from different angles and they know bits and pieces of information. So I think giving more informed opinions is important.
Is there any learning from, you referenced Rwanda?
But maybe what we haven't learned, but we can learn, we can really put into practice, is the fact that, as I've been writing, I wrote a book on the marginalized voices in genocide narratives, where, pretty much genocide does not drop from the sky. Genocide is a process that is being built through impunity at different levels. So in the context of Rwanda, for instance, the teachers, they were separating children. The radio was talking about Tutsi being cockroaches, so creating this dehumanizing narrative. The people who were helping were being, targeted and punished. There was, and when I look at the current situation, I can see this. There are 10 steps to genocide happening, and I can see how those 10 steps have been taking place in the context of Gaza. And again, scholars have been saying that, I keep saying that, what we see according to the definition of genocide is genocide. And I'm not speaking as an opinion, I'm speaking as a fact. And but in the context of Rwanda, because of the political forces behind, we have action that is very, very slow to take place. But I think that, again, we need to keep pushing. That would be my position. It's interesting because in my book, I wrote about the role of bystanders in genocide. And I think that, again, there is something about many of us now being bystanders, looking at what is happening and just feeling powerless and doing nothing, or just feeling it's just too much. It's so complex. People say it's so complex and not doing much. And that's exactly what happened in the context of the Holocaust. That's what happened in the context of Rwanda, that people just felt a bit, there's so much going on. And the situation is never clear in context of war. So you never know. You can't take right or wrong position. You just need to take a position that is principled to you. So my research shows that we need to pretty much begin to target all the impunity at the social, political, imagined, levels, because it's through impunity over time of different actors that genocide is made possible. But what gives me a bit of consolation is that having kind of grown up at the time of South Africa and apartheid, is that the apartheid regime was dismantled, but people who started talking about that, they were starting talking about the apartheid in the 50s, and it was dismantled 4 decades later. So we just also need to think of the short term. There needs to be action now for this kind of killing, extermination, ethnic cleansing to stop. But we also need to think in the longer term, what is that we want to imagine that part of the world to be, but also the role of the West and the ways in which the global community is, relating to one another. Because what we see in Gaza is also the really strong undermining of the legal framework that has been in existence since World War II. And that is relevant for everybody in every country.
Yes.
I have something else,
Please.
which I forgot to say.
Please.
And I'm now speaking in my personal capacity, not as a UEA representative. But I also think that as consumers, we do have power.
Great.
So I do think that the issue of choosing that you don't want to bank with, or don't want to have an insurance, or don't want to buy products that contribute to the flourishing of, whether it's illegal settlements, whether it's the arms industry, whether it's the environmental or crisis. I think that's something that could make a difference, because you talked about the environmental crisis. That is going to affect us all. It's already affecting us in the UK. And we need to begin to both act in the direction of saving the Mother Earth, as I like to think of it, but also in challenging the impunity of those who may be creating a situation. Because in history, we will be reminded in my case, as a generation of people who, grew up and actually ruined the world, ruined the earth for consumerism. It's not a good legacy to have, and I think that younger generations now are really much more aware and can really do a lot to really change the narrative, change the action, change the way we think about the world we live in.
I hope so. I really hope so.
Sorry, I've gone through my kind of idealistic bit. I apologize for that kind of passionate Italian last call for action and thinking and imagining another world, but I think it's important. Yeah.
I was going to finish by asking what your hope for the future is, and you can still have that as a question, but it sounds like you've sort of given it.
Yeah, I've already given it my answer. I am an optimistic type, I should say, even though there are many challenges at the moment, because having worked in the field of refugees, conflicts, this is not a great time for people who have worked and are passionate about this. But I'm an optimistic type and person, and in that regard, I think that we just need to keep pushing in all. And I just think just the whole spectrum. One tiny action, if you can, multiple actions, whatever suits you, just do something. At least you know that inside you are going in the direction of justice. That's like me. That's my life, both my professional life and my personal life. It's always, with all the challenges and all the limitations, because of course you can't do everything all the time, but at least trying to do something makes you not a bystander at this time in history, a very important time in history.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. And unless there's anything you wanted to add, Giorgia, at this point, I would just thank you for coming on the podcast. I like what you said at the end, and it marks you out as an activist, right? Not just an expert in the field or an academic, but an activist, and a call that more of us should become active people in this process rather than bystanders looking on. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I would love to bring you back on, and perhaps we can dig into some other subjects too, but for now I'll just say thanks.
Yeah, and thank you very much for having me, and bye to your audience as well, and let's keep at it.
So what are the major takeaways from this conversation? First, let's not allow the right-wing, aggressive voices to steal the narrative here with misleading and inaccurate information. Get clued up. In 2024, those seeking asylum represented only 16% of net migration to the UK. The other 84% were people coming for work and study. What was it Georgia said? 85% of refugees settle in a neighbouring country? Some of these countries have absorbed millions of people forcibly displaced. They're not all coming to sink the British Isles. Only a fraction of people actually make the trip to the UK. Here's another one for you. 37% of the world's refugees, so comfortably over a third, are hosted by just 5 countries: Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, and Germany. Yes, Germany are hosting 2.7 million refugees seeking asylum. The UK have just over 500,000. Okay, Germany's a bigger country than the UK. Yeah, it's 1.5 times the size of the UK, but it's taking over 5 times more refugees. But let's try and keep things in perspective. This is an international challenge to be managed internationally. What emerges clearly from everything Georgia has been saying is the urgent need for collaboration to protect international institutions, however imperfect, from being dismantled. Only by working with other countries on complex challenges like immigration can we hope to make meaningful progress. We should work with our European neighbours and take our fair share. We should also remain actively involved in combating the drivers of forced migration, such as climate change and conflict. The alternative, of course, is to shut the borders and vote in a right-wing nationalist party that promises to solve all of our problems by simply eliminating migrants. This is the panacea that will make Britain great again, apparently. These are the same people who promised that leaving the EU would solve all of our problems, especially with the NHS and immigration. How's that working out? We need Europe and other neighbouring countries for trade, to buy our goods, to staff our shops, restaurants, hospitals, care homes, factories and fields. We desperately need migration. Our economy would collapse without it. And as much as we love to romanticise about the great British Empire and take pride in our grandparents' victory over Hitler, quite rightly, the world, however, has changed, and we no longer have the military power to stand alone against tyranny. We need alliances, we need coalitions, we need international institutions to protect us from larger threats. We have to resist this temptation to turn our backs on the world and to think that isolationism, protectionism, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, is the answer. It is not. So what is? Open borders? No, of course not. I'm all for greater border security and identification procedures. I want to know who is coming into this country and whether they present a threat. However, I am in agreement with Professor Giorgia Dona, rather than try to wriggle out of our responsibilities, that the UK should share the burden with its neighbours, not reluctantly, but proudly, as a strong, welcoming and hospitable nation. And we should be fast-tracking asylum claims to expedite people's integration into our communities and the great British workforce. People want to work, to contribute, to be self-sufficient. One last statistic to reflect on. Of the 123 million people currently forcibly displaced from their homes in this world, 50 million are children. Come on, people. What makes a country great anyway? Weapons or welcomes? Hey, still lots to discuss here, but thank you for listening in and keep DMing me with your suggestions for subjects and guests. It's really helpful. You can message me at Bryn Smith on Instagram. This podcast was produced by Blue Bear Coffee Company. We use coffee as our vehicle for change, and all of our net profits are used to protect, equip and empower children whose lives have been impacted by human trafficking. Find out more by visiting bluebearcoffee.com or follow us on social media at Blue Bear Coffee. Have a great week. Peace.